IndependentLeft.news. Great work.
Indie Left News.
The Independent Left News.
Independent Left News.
Shout out to Independent Left News. Shout out. Oh, what's up, Independent Left? Friend show.
Thank you, Independent Left News.
The INN, Indy, you're wonderful.
I think Indy was onto something.
Independent News Network, Indie News.
Yeah. What's up, Indy, over on Rockfin?
Independent News Network, also known as INN.
Indie Left News.
I don't know if I would have made it through that 3 weeks without Indy, honestly.
No, I was just going to ask Indy.
A huge thank you and shout out to Indy Left.
No, you know what we're doing? We're world building, Indy.
Indie Left News.
You were doing the INN recruiting.
Indie News.
Independent Left News.
Shout out to Independent Left News.
Check out Independent Left News.
At Kennedy News.
I see Indy's in the chat. Hi, Indy. Okay, great. Bye.
Welcome to the Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism. Whether you're a news junkie, a curious learner, or just looking for a fresh perspective away from the corporate media, this is the show for you. So join us now as we dive into the world of independent journalism on the Independent Review.
Welcome to the 21st episode of the Independent Review. Today we have clips from Johnny Vedmore, the Truth Over Comfort podcast macroaggressions, and the last American Vagabond. Now let's jump to the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Johnny Vedmore.
The hills are alive with the sound of pasty. Look what's happening. Yes. We're all cats now, my friend. We've entered the pasty dome.
The point of it was she was being called despicable. She was told that she cannot have the opinion. So the child was saying that her opinion is that you can't change your gender. The teacher, and I will make a direct quote, said, that is not an opinion that we express in this school. And if you don't like it, you need to go to a different school. Now, Dominic.
Well, look at this. This little kitty cat on the news. Now, normally you can't say that, but GB News is trying to pose themselves as this anti-establishment news organization on the side. Look at us. We try and give you a more Fox-like, a little edgy approach to the news. However, we agree with nearly everything the establishment says in nearly every single detail. We love the establishment, and the establishment is there, and we will constantly scare and do all the other things, and at the same time complain about what's happened in a way like we're the opposition. But that's GB News for you. Hey, look at this. She's got her cat ears on, and she's made up with a little nose and little whiskers that makes her look a little cute. And she's in a nice flowery dress, and she's telling us about cat identity, because that's what we've got to now. And you know we're in bad place when we're talking about kids identifying as cats, especially when we know what cats do. You damn cats. And what's that? I see a cat, and he's eating a pasty.
As much as I'm being silly with my fancy dress, this is a very serious story, because I mean, what is going on in this world when children consider that they're cats and be taken seriously at school?
Exactly, and I'm afraid that
it's amazing. The one woman's dressed up as a cat, and this woman's dressed up as a Tarabakan marmot. Who would have guessed it?
Teacher is just one of the many examples we're seeing
sorry, I called you a Tarabakan marmot,
teachers, educators, people that are trusted with, you know, our children's understanding of this world, their readiness to actually explore different points of view. When teachers are actively, very aggressively shouting that down in quite an emotionally unstable way, I think. I don't know whether or not the issue.
Now, I can agree with this. This is the problem with all these identity clash. Oh, we're having an identity clash, we are, because this girl identifies as cat and this guy over here identifies as this and identifies as that. If you allow kids to seek attention, they will seek attention, of course. That's what kids do. They're like, I'm a butterfly. No, you're not a butterfly. Oh, he's talking to me. Oh, I'm a really big butterfly. No, you're not a really big butterfly. Oh my God, I'm so a butterfly all the time, and now I'm going to dress up as a butterfly because you're giving me attention. That's basically the cycle of every single kid in this situation. You're a girl. I am a girl, yes. Yes, you're a girl forever now. Yes, I'm going to be a girl forever. And as soon as you're not a girl, we'll stop paying attention to you. No, don't do that. I will have my bit surgically removed just so that you look at me again, Daddy, and love me. That you love me.
It was very personal to that teacher in particular, but the way she dealt with it was completely unprofessional. And
everybody knows that this teacher was probably a mad cat lady. So, I mean, imagine you're in a classroom, you're teaching your students, and you've separated your psychological love of cats for your teaching and your work, and then suddenly there's a cat in amongst your students just sitting there doing whatever she was doing, like math or something. Just this cat meowing away. A meow 1 plus meow 2 equals meow 4, meow. Oh, you seem a little dumb. Meow, I'm a cat, meow. Oh, that's a good reason. Okay, as you're a cat, we're going to boost all of your grades up.
And to say that if you express these views that she really has decided is unacceptable, I'm not sure she speaks for the whole entire school, if you don't like it, find another school, is an example of how polarised this debate has actually become, where anyone who expresses, you know, a pretty much scientifically sound view that there are only 2 genders and that identifying yourself with a cat is, you know, really, it doesn't make any sense at all, does it? You get shouted down and called a homophobe. She's linked it to homophobia.
She said she was
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Listen, okay, right. I'm listening to this woman. I know GB News has probably got a small pot to choose from, but, you know, this isn't the most exciting debate you can have on this topic. And, you know, this is all linked in with the trans debate. But the idea that you're homophobic if you don't like cats is true. It's true. I can tell you that's fact. I've not only proven it multiple times, but I am it. There you go. So don't argue with me. You can't argue with me. I identify as a person who's right 100% of the time. There you go. Wait a minute. No, I can identify as a cat who's right 100% of the time. So meow to you. You meow, meow.
She was saying, why do you think, this is a direct quote, why do you think we have so many problems in the world with homophobia? Now look at this little graphic,
everyone. Why do you think we have so many problems in the world with pasties?
There's about 70-odd genders. This one describes 18. This was an NHS questionnaire.
I'd like to see your gender fluid.
With all of these different genders, which one are you? This is bonkers, isn't it, Nigel?
I'm a transgender man.
The teacher was unnecessarily aggressive on this one.
An agenda
I thought the kids were actually fighting back quite admirably. And where the teacher should have gone with this conversation is, no, you can't identify as a cat or an aardvark or a chihuahua or something like.
No, wait. No one is talking about not being able to identify as an aardvark. That, sir, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about cats. We're not talking about aardvarks, and I take exception to that. On News Pasties, all about taking exceptions to identifying, not being told you can't identify as an aardvark. That's what we're all about.
Right. You cannot identify as a different species.
But you think you can change your gender?
But I do think you can change your gender, and so.
And women look pretty good when they got cat ears on, like meow meow, isn't it?
So that is enshrined.
He should have put cat ears on. Maybe if he had put cat ears on, he would have looked dreamy too. Little bit of black on his nose and some whiskers. Why didn't he? I bet you they asked him and he was like, "No, I'm not going to do that because it'll confuse people. Because the people who watch GB News are really, really stupid."
In British law for most purposes.
So you think, so for example, I could decide so you're saying...
that you're a pussy. You can decide that you're a pussy. That's what you can do. You can decide that you're a pussy. Pussy. Look at you. You look like a pussy. You sound like a pussy. You're on the Pussy News Network. You're there, pussy.
Cats is me taking it too far, but I could
It's a different species, so it would be ridiculous.
So as long as
any
it's
more
the
than
same
you're a pillar box
species,
or something.
I could identify, as long as it's the same species, you're comfortable that I could identify as that. So I could identify as a man.
Yes, you can.
Could I identify as a black man?
Then it gets more complicated.
The old ones are the best. Can I identify as a man? Yes, you can identify as a man. Can I identify as a tanned man? Okay, you can identify as a tanned man. Can I identify as a black man? Yeah, no, don't do that. If you identify as a black man, you know what happens? They send you to prison straight away. Oh, we got another black man. What? He's come up on the radar. Beep, 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 beep. Oh no, the black man alert's got off at the police station. Let's send out the black police officers, and they're not the police officers who are black. Actually, some of them are, but they're police officers who deal with black people, because that's what happens in most places around. And I myself, I am considering identifying half Chinese and half black. So in the future, I want to be called when I can't do it. I mean, that's really hard. Okay, I'm gonna do it. Try it at home. I want you to try this at home. Come up with a half Asian and a half African name. Okay, so I'm gonna go with Wen Magubu. That's my name. I'm Wen Magubu. What are you? Are you Chen Magibi? I don't know, but I think you should do this. Everybody needs a half African and half Asian name, and you can switch them around. You can be either one, and you can identify as what you like. We're identifying as what we like. So I'm half African and half Asian. I'm not even like half Angolan or half Chad. No, I'm half the entirety of Africa. I'm everything. I am all of Africa, and I am all of Asia. I'm not from Cambodia, Burma, China. I'm from all of them. I identify as all of them, except Mongolian. No, I don't want to be a Mongol. That's it. I don't want to be a Mongol. Bad advertising through the 80s and 90s, so I'm not interested. So that's the only thing I don't identify in Africa and Asia. I don't identify as a Mongol. There you go. What am I even saying?
Because transgender is something that is a personal necessity. If you're trying to change your race, that is a choice, and it also affects another community.
Well,
to reach a master race, you must be half Asian and half African. That is my ruling from now on. And you must speak like a mad German.
Do you not think that this whole transgender thing affects another community? Men saying that they can be women. Do you not think that the community of women are affected by that?
Well,
said the cat to the man.
They are, and that's where we talk about women's spaces. But if under the law, a woman can have a
women's spaces. Kitty faces. Yeah, sorry, I just had to say that.
Penis.
Yeah, I mean,
the question
then. Wait a minute. Did he just say penis? I think he did. I'm gonna rewind it. I want to hear him say penis again. Let's hear it.
Penis.
Yeah.
The question then,
oh my God, he just said it. That was interesting. I'm gonna say it one more time. Go on, give it one more time.
Penis.
Yeah,
the question then is whether or not that woman should be able to use women-only spaces. I think not, by the way. But the only difference under the law is you don't send a trans woman with male genitalia into a prison.
Well, yeah. Firstly, just because something is law doesn't mean that it makes sense or that it's right. And you know, if something
just because something's long doesn't make it right. I mean, law. Sorry, I'm thinking of penises again. Yum, yum, yum.
It's not right. Just because it's law, that doesn't mean, you know, you have to follow it. It's my personal view.
Well, you have to follow the law.
Well, you don't have to follow the law if it's not right, and that's how...
Well, I don't know. I think officially you have to follow the law, because most of the law we got now could be debated on, and eventually will probably change over time. Yes. Changes happen over time.
People affect change. But on that, the logic is the same. It doesn't matter if you're identifying as a different race or if you're identifying as a different species, because the whole point of being transgender and having gender dysphoria is the idea that you were placed in the wrong body.
Well, that is to one person. I bet you there'll be other complicated versions of it that come out, but basically that's the best they got. You placed in the wrong body is what they got, but in actual fact, they've been placed in the wrong mind mentally. They are mental. They are completely mental. Now, if they were a transgender cat, I would say that makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to see more transgender cats. So I'd like to see us create quotas, transgender cats, no aardvarks, kill the aardvarks.
And you identify with another gender. So using that logic, you can feel like you were born into the wrong race, because that's a biological thing. You can feel as though me not being white is materially affecting my life and my mental health.
What? Wait, what? She's not white, and that bloody causes her problems. Oh, I don't know about that. I thought she was white myself.
Same with a different species. I mean, it's not entirely uncommon for people.
Oh no! Now I've seen it. Now she's talking about people. Now I see it. This lady should also be wearing cat ears. I think they should all be wearing cat ears. I'm really disappointed with them all. I think this is, even the one wearing cat ears, I'm disappointed with her for not insisting that, that they should wear cat ears.
Who identify with animals and want to be animals. I mean, online you can find where people can actually pretend to be dogs and foxes.
But they can't be a dog or a fox.
But they believe it in their minds, so the logic is the same. It is.
I worry about this because it's all well and good to be a little bit flippant about.
It's all well and good, but if you type in doggy style online, I think we all know what's coming up.
But to me, there is a real safeguarding issue here. So you've got companies, external companies, that are going into schools in this country. Parents are not allowed to see what it is, the material that these children are receiving. A parent was going through a tribunal recently.
Wow, can you imagine some of the stuff they're showing? So this is a beaver's anatomy, and this is what eventually you want your anatomy to look like. So hey, you want to have a beaver, then what you've got to do is basically Shiva and cleaver your beaver, or no, Shiva and cleaver your beaver to get a beaver, if you know what I mean. And then you got the beefiest beaver that you could possibly find. That's what you've got to do. Now, are you ready to do that? Don't tell your parents. Don't tell your parents about your beaver, Shiva, cleaver.
And was again, she failed at a challenge to see this material because what they were saying is showing this material that kids are being taught would breach the confidentiality that they have in place with these schools and
showing the material these kids have been taught will breach the gates, and eventually you would see people hanging from the rafters. Is that what you're saying? I think that's what you're saying. You see, it would be a catastrophe, be a cat, catastrophe, cat. It identifies a catastrophe cat. There's a cat in catastrophe.
Reduce their ability to commercialise their proposition. If the material was in the public domain, they couldn't be able to monetise it. This is so worrying. And I think actually parents do need to stand up to this, push back.
I'm not sure how many cats have spots on their chin. I think that's just going too far. Look at that. Look at the spots on their chin. I don't think that's right. I got cats and they don't have spots on their chin. I'm going to have to make a point of this.
Back against it, because children, they shouldn't be told you cannot say that there's two genders. You have to respect everyone for whatever it is, whatever. But yet, actually, when someone feels that two genders is a real thing, as is biological sex, that one, you don't have to respect that one.
I gotta say that even from someone who's basically down with what she's saying, listening to stupid people explain to people at home why they need to stop doing this isn't news. This isn't unbiased reporting. The report is currently saying what you can and can't do. This isn't investigating. This isn't her reporting. She's literally just saying this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. So even though I'm down with the subject and all of that, this is a bunch of pasty from a pasty master. It's
just a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, but that's the kind of debate that you should have in the schools. And so I can see no reason why teachers shouldn't talk about transgender issues in schools. And the government are coming out with some guidance that you're talking about there.
Why shouldn't they talk about transgender issues in school? Because school will teach them some random, banal middle ground that'll lead everybody to being confused about everything because it won't make any sense, and that's what's been proven. So you can't see any reason. You can't see any reason. Are you stupid? Have you got... This guy must be stupid. He must have the mind of a cat. His mind must identify as a cat's mind.
About what would be appropriate, both by age and the material that is actually being given to kids.
What's
the thing is,
ideology
it seems
in school,
as though these charities and these companies are all trying to outperform each other with how inclusive and in-depth that they can be, which is what is leading to these detailed and really, I think, quite indoctrinating ideas about gender and really presenting them as fact. I think it's sort of a fever pitch where they all just want to outperform each other. But I think
she's right. They do want to outperform each other, just like these sites, channels, and news channels want to outperform each other on discussing this issue, but they're discussing just the same things. They can't go outside the box. The same discussions that we had here will be had on Sky, will be had on Channel 4, will be had on NBC, ABC, Australian TV, South African TV. It doesn't matter. They'll all have the same things, where they'll have the same conversations, and it's still leading to people having their bits, kids having their bits chopped off. Well done. Oh, you've done a really good job of safeguarding, haven't you, human race all around the world?
I think parents should definitely have more of a say, because at the end of the day, it's them that should be in charge of their children's education.
I think parents should have more of a say. It's amazing that this is like the whole thing, that this is a shtick, that people are legally making other people's kids, grooming them to a certain way of thinking. That's crazy. The only way that could happen in the world, the only way that could be normalized, is if everybody had pasties for eyes and pasties for brains and all.
I don't think it should be a random teacher with ideological views who pushes that onto vulnerable.
Well, synapse changes that you're referring to, some people are saying they're reminiscent of Section 28, which we'll all remember that ban promotion of homosexuality. Anyway, some of the things that he's saying, which sound like common sense to me, teachers must tell parents that their child is questioning their gender.
That's pretty normal, but you know what that would mean? That does mean that they're not going to have a conversation. They're not going to have a conversation with their teachers, so you don't get any type of loop round. So it's never going to sort out the problem. And if they're questioning their gender, then there's got to be said something about the entire wider society and what they're being taught on TV and what they're seeing online.
New preferred pronouns until the parents consent. The kids and the teachers don't have to respect the chosen pronouns for the pupils. Would you kind of agree with those measures?
Well, the whole thing there is that whatever
linguistics. This is all this is. Linguistics. Do you linguistically want to recognize someone's linguistic right to be called something? I don't think linguistic rights is a thing. They obviously do. They believe that you can enforce rights for people to say something about another person. It's just not going to happen ever in a million years. Never, ever, weather. And if you go around and call someone like me cis male, I'm going to say, no, I'm not. And they're going to say, yes, you are. And it's going to be an argument, of course, because they're talking nonsense. They're making up words. It's all linguistic. It's all linguistic. It's all about language. Nothing about anything else. It's not really about cats. It's not really about cats. Did you know it's not really about cats? I'm saying that categorically speaking. Cat. Categorically cat. Cat. Categorically. Cat is categorically speaking. Categorically.
A teacher does should be in the child's best interest. So if a child comes to a teacher and says, look, I think I'm transgender or I'm gay or whatever, please don't...
No. If a child comes to a teacher and says, meow, 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 meow,
tell mum and dad, I think the teacher should respect that. Parents shouldn't have a veto over what their children are being taught.
You'd be very happy with your son going to school and
coming
being
back
regarded in every way at school as a girl.
As a pasty.
And you have no knowledge of it. So your
You have
kid is
no
now going,
knowledge.
she's called Sarah at school, she's going to girls'
She's a
toilets.
pasty called
she's talking
Sarah.
about
She's going to
breast
the
binding,
girls'
chest
toilet.
binding, she's talking about potentially being put on a pathway to bodily mutilation
Yeah,
and hormones. You'd be comfortable
go
not
on.
knowing any of that.
All this is a long way down the road. I mean, you're
No, it's
talking
not.
about somebody you
It's
might be
happening
thinking
now.
about
this is the long
becoming
bit.
transgender.
Well, I tell you, I think this is all a very slippery slope. And as a mum myself, I certainly do worry about this issue. I think it's one of the most serious things going on in...
Oh, God, news pasty. I call pasty on all of this. Pasty on all of this. Pasty on both your houses.
Being a great reset for the post-corona era.
Next, let's take a look at this clip from the Truth Over Comfort podcast with Vanessa Beeley.
Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Vanessa Beeley. She is an independent journalist who's covered the Middle East for, around a decade. But specifically today, we're here to talk about Syria. I'm very happy to have Vanessa here. How are you doing today?
Hi, Louis. Thanks for inviting me on. Sorry, it took a bit of time to get me to sort myself out, but it's quite tough here in Syria to pick times and get good internet, etc.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I just appreciate you being here now. But for people, who don't know you, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself and your work? And then, we can get to the Syrian conflict, obviously, the foreign actors in it, the rebels, and we can, get to the current situation. But first, just you want to let people know a little bit about yourself and your work.
Well, basically, I'm just an independent journalist and photographer that has been working in the Middle East since around 2011, 2012. I was in Gaza in 2012 in the Israeli aggression then. That's where I met Eva Bartlett, another amazing colleague of mine who's currently in Russia and has spent considerable time in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, now Russia, of course. Basically, through her, I kind of got involved into Syria and what was going on there from about 2013 onwards. I ended up going to Syria in 2016, having tried on various occasions before that, but there was always a difficulty getting visas and so on because it's a country at war. And then basically from 2016 to 2019, I covered most of the liberation campaigns from the front lines at the various cities and regions in Syria that were being liberated by the Syrian army from terrorist, Western-backed terrorist occupation. And from 2019 onwards, I've been living here. So I've been living here, this is my 4th year. But I've also covered events in Donbass. I went to Donbass November last year for the referendum, for which I was threatened with personal sanctions in France. A letter was actually written to Joseph Borrell demanding that I be put under personal sanctions, just me, out of 133 observers, because I was a sadist, first of all, and a Putinist second. This is what they do. We're all pretty much on the kill list in Ukraine, the NATO Ukrainian kill list. Journalists with dissident views are either to be interrogated or assassinated these days. That's basically what it's come to. And I've also covered since 2015 the Saudi, US, UK allied war in Yemen. I've been to Iraq and so on. So my focus is, and Egypt, I lived in Egypt for quite a while in 2013. So my focus is basically on events in the Middle East with, I guess, the majority of my reporting having been on Syria and particularly the UK intelligence role in the destabilization of Syria, not only since 2011, but historically.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting smeared and called names like that, you're normally doing a good job because they come after, they come after your character or stuff like that rather than the actual information, which is,
yeah.
But yeah, if you want to take people back, just before the Civil War or the so-called Civil War,
yeah,
the Arabs, and what were the events that led up to this and the Arab Spring?
Oof. Well, I mean, I have actually written, and people can go to my various platforms and websites and find the article. I've written about the 75 years of regime change in Syria by the MI6 and CIA. So what happened in 2011 was, let's say, just a continuation of what had been going on since Syria achieved independence from France or French mandate in 1946. And that, of course, had been organized under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which carved up the Middle East and gave bits to Britain and bits to France and so on, and Syria was under French mandate. So in 1945, the French violently opposed independence, and they attacked Damascus, killing, I think, more than 400 civilians. And in 1946, finally, Syria achieved independence. From that day on, there have been endless CIA, MI6 orchestrated coup d'etat and regime change to effectively try and divorce Syria from its long-standing relationship with previously the Soviet Union and now with Russia. And this has been the underlying, I guess, reason for, along with many other reasons, but this is one of the main reasons, is that they were desperate to basically cut the relationship between Soviet Union and Russia and Syria. And as a result, in I think it was 2009. I mean, there's a lot of other things that went on before then, but people will get bogged down in it, and I know it's a lot of details. So if they're interested, go and find the article that I wrote, and there's a lot of resources and links to DIA, declassified intelligence documents in the US that clearly demonstrate that the project to destabilize Syria, to impose an Islamist regime that would be compliant with US policy in the region, not only US, UK, EU, policy in the region has been a long-standing one. And that the two Assad presidents, Hafez al-Assad, who came to power in '71, and his son Bashar al-Assad, who was never destined to be president, but his brother, his older brother Basil, was killed in 1999, I think. And Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000. In 2009, he basically turned down the US-backed Qatari pipeline proposal in favor of the Iranian oil and gas pipeline proposal, which was backed by Russia. So from if you go back pre-2009, you will struggle to find any negative commentary on President Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because since 9/11 and since the second Iraqi illegal invasion by the US, which was pre-planned also, there was a project to try and win over Bashar al-Assad and to bring him over to the side of the West. But unfortunately, it failed dismally because Assad is a man of principle and a man of integrity, and he refused to basically abandon his allies, including Russia, but including also Iran, Hezbollah, Palestine. And also, he had a vision for Syria being the hub of the multipolar world. So even back in 2004, President Assad was planning the 5 Cs project, which would effectively make Syria the hub of all trade coming from China, from Iran, from Iraq, and into Europe. This was anathema to the West because they wanted complete control not only of that trade, but also of those resources. You know, heaven forbid, south-to-south trading would be allowed. All kind of resource piracy was going on even at that point, and Syria was threatening it. Bashar al-Assad and his visions of joining with the Belt and Road Initiative with China and creating all those various rail and road links to facilitate trade between, I hate the word global south, but between global south countries and then global south to global north, right? So going quickly forward, all of this was already being planned. In 2009, British officials approached Roland Dumas, the then French foreign minister, and told him, we're planning an insurgence in Syria. using the Muslim Brotherhood and armed militants to topple the government, because they're basically not doing what we want them to do. And so then what happened in 2011, you had the CIA MI6 orchestrated Arab Spring across a multitude of Arab states. There's a very good documentary by Journeyman called The Revolution Business, which I recommend everyone watches, which shows exactly how they planned, for example, the so-called revolution in Egypt, and how that then kind of had a domino effect into all the other Middle Eastern countries, including Syria. So in 2011, their plans were put into action. The media was tasked with then depicting President Bashar al-Assad as, you know, the new Hitler. That's their kind of standard phraseology when they want to start demonizing a leader of a recalcitrant state that isn't coming into line. Syria also had an independent monetary policy. It wasn't tied into the IMF and the World Bank and so on. So, you know, another nail in its coffin, so to speak, right? And so in 2011, the so-called civil war began, and the so-called peaceful protests, which were far from peaceful. The majority of those killed in the first 6 months were the security forces and police forces. The protests, I've actually made a documentary about this called The Veto, which details all the early protests and how people were paid around $50 to go out on the streets and protest against the government and allow themselves to be filmed by the CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, Qatar, put around more than $3 billion into the regime change project, using its media to sow confusion at the beginning of the uprisings and the insurgents. And then basically, you know, the rest is kind of history. Arms were pouring in from Libya through Turkey. Terrorists were coming in from Libya through Turkey and into Syria. Arms were coming in from Jordan. Armed groups were being trained in Jordan by the US and the UK. Turkey was training armed groups in Turkey. Saudi Arabia was funding groups like ISIS. Qatar was funding the Muslim Brotherhood and their then collaboration with and kind of morphing with Al-Qaeda. And so therefore the rest is history. Then the terrorist groups merged with the so-called Muslim Brotherhood moderates or rebels, as you mentioned, which I always put in speech marks because they're about, you know, grassroots rebels don't have Grad missiles under their beds when they start protests, right? You know, I mean, this should have set alarm bells off with people immediately, but you know, the media did a very good job. It sold Bashar al-Assad as this demon who was gassing and torturing and imprisoning and neutralizing his own people. The Palestinian movement was basically weaponized against Syria. That also had been pre-planned, even though Syria has actually probably been the most hospitable country in the Middle East towards Palestinian refugees after the 1948 Nakba. So basically, sorry, that went on a bit longer than I intended. But, you know, it's a bit like saying the war in Ukraine started in 2022 when Russia carried out its special military operation. It didn't. It started in 2014 with the regime change that was orchestrated by Victoria Nuland and brought the Nazis to power, basically in Ukraine. And you can go even further back, of course, in history to World War II, when the Nazis were being smuggled out and given safe haven by the US and by the UK with the sole purpose of eventually becoming a club with which to batter Russia with. So, you know, this is the point. People tend to look at the start points that the media give them. And they have a reluctance to look at the history that led up to that. And you know, media is, particularly in the West, it's an expert in manipulating opinion and manufacturing consent for intervention by proxy or directly.
Yeah, no, just to back you up on a few comments you made there, I think I remember, didn't Tony Blair have Assad come to the UK and meet the Queen?
Yeah,
And yes,
2002.
Yeah, so there's obviously an attempt at normalization there. You had sort of, another point you made about he was labeled Hitler, George H.W. Bush, when the Gulf War was kicking off, calling him Hitler, but only a few years before that, they're backing Saddam Hussein in, obviously, the Iran-Iraq war, which, again, goes with, you say, the media start at this point and they kind of ignore everything, before that. And the documentaries you mentioned, I will put that in the show notes so people can find that. You kind of mentioned it there, like the other state actors involved, but can you just tell all the different countries who were part of actually obviously trying to overthrow the Syrian regime, because there's lots of other countries there you didn't mention, like Saudi Arabia and Israel. So who was kind of the coalition of countries that were trying to overthrow the Syrian regime?
Well, I mean, basically, you've got the US and UK leading the project, but then you've got France coming close behind that, because, of course, France still, I mean, if you look at some of the rhetoric from French politicians, particularly during the liberation of Aleppo, when Manuel Valls in Parliament was calling it France's Aleppo, I mean, he was actually calling it, it's our Aleppo, we should defend our Aleppo. So clearly the French still had delusions of mandate in Syria, like almost, what was it, well, 75 years plus on, they still considered Syria to be their territory, as they do with many African countries, of course. So France, the majority of EU countries were involved, including Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, most of them actually, bar probably countries like Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, sorry, kept its embassy here throughout the war. Hungary also was involved to a large degree, supporting particularly the church and the Christian communities in Syria during the war. Romania kind of kept out of it. Serbia kept out of it because, one, they're not part of the EU, two, the people are very close to Russia, and they have, an affinity with Syria because of what happened to former Yugoslavia, of course, which was completely balkanized and carved up and bombed to smithereens by NATO in the late 90s. And then you have, I guess, all the Five Eyes countries. So you have Canada, Australia, even New Zealand, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. So they were really in competition because, as I mentioned, Saudi was funding groups like ISIS and some of the more Wahhabi-related groups. Qatar was very close to the Muslim Brotherhood groups, which include Al-Qaeda. Obviously, Israel was instrumental in this entire project because it has long-term perceived Syria as probably its primary enemy in the Middle East, alongside Iran and Hezbollah, because Israel perceives that as an entire bloc which has the destruction of Israel as their vision, or rather the liberation of Palestine, which I guess by default means the destruction of Israel as it is now. Jordan played a part, Turkey, of course. Turkey also was involved in imposing the non-UN mandated sanctions on Syria from the beginning. Those are the main players. I might have missed one or two, but those are the main players.
Yeah, and obviously alongside that, which I find quite mind-boggling, and probably if you spoke to most people, that obviously we're on the same side as Al-Qaeda affiliates, and obviously eventually ISIS. They have the same goal of overthrowing the Syrian regime. We just have obviously 9/11 happen, and all these wars, justified because of them, to the public, and somehow you go from that to literally being on the same side as them, and similar situation in Libya and Yemen. So reading, I read I think it was Scott Horton's book Enough Already, and he has a chapter on Syria, and there was like so many news articles, talking about arms falling into Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or they'd be training or arming the Syrian Free Army, but they're much weaker, so they'd end up just joining them, or they wasn't as strong. So were obviously the Gulf nations, it could be another question, but the Western or westernized countries and allies, were they directly supporting these terrorist groups, or indirectly, like arms were falling into their hands and they could have plausible deniability? Where do you fall on it?
And it's like, how convenient.
Yeah.
No, of course they were supporting it. And I mean, there was a closed session meeting in the UN with John Kerry under the Obama administration in September 2016, where he basically admitted we were allowing, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, we allowed ISIS to flourish because we considered it the best bet to overthrow the Syrian government. And now the US has control of the Northeast. And there are still around 15,000 ISIS terrorists and their various family members held in basically holding camps in the Northeast. And the US is ferrying them regularly from Iraq to their bases there, to the US bases there for further training and renewing their weapons before sending them back into Syria to carry out attacks against the Syrian army, or into Iraq to destroy civilian infrastructure like electrical power stations and so on. And, you know, it's a fairly well-known fact now that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are proxies of the US-UK cartel in Syria. I mean, Jake Sullivan in 2012 wrote the famous email to Hillary Clinton where he basically said Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, as of course it was when they created it in Afghanistan prior to the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. You know, that was admitted by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Clinton admitted that they created the Mujahideen to finish off the Soviet Union, and it was successful to a large degree.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these Mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine, you deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
But Brzezinski admitted that they were planning that before Soviet Union entered Afghanistan. So they created Al-Qaeda from that point, right? And it came from Yemen. Al-Qaeda, Arab Peninsula, was almost destroyed post-2012. From 2015, when the aggression started against the Yemeni people, funnily enough, Al-Qaeda, which had almost disappeared, suddenly reappeared and you know, basically was bolstered and became a severe threat again. And it now occupies areas of the South, of course, areas of the South that are strategically important, both to the US, UK, and to the Saudi coalition. Things are changing now since the peace was brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia by China, but it's going to take a lot of time because Saudi isn't going to give up on its, Saudi Arabia and the US and UK aren't going to give up on their project in Yemen either, which is also sort of course, inherently linked to resources, to oil resources, and also positioning on the oh God, I've just forgotten the name of the straits, the Yemeni straits. Right. It'll come back to me in a minute. Not the Hormuz Straits, but the other side. Bab el-Mandeb, that's it. and the connection to the Horn of Africa, because of course Africa is incredibly important to, particularly to the French and the British, but also now to the US, of course, for its resource piracy and digital mining also in the future. And so basically all of these groups, yes, were and are directly sponsored, equipped, trained, recruited by the US cartel, by the neo-colonialist cartel, and that includes the UK. Now, of course, the idea, the train and equip program, which Obama set up, which was only really, I think, for 500 so-called moderates, funnily enough, all the weapons that were coming in for them, which included, of course, surface-to-air missiles and the TOW missiles and so on, and the various manpads, etc., funnily enough, fell into the hands of ISIS. And under, the US war against terror in Syria, which of course is the main pretext for them being in Syria, what happened? ISIS actually flourished and was increasing its hold on Syrian territory. I mean, there's the famous story, I think, in 2013, when ISIS managed to cross something like 500 kilometers of desert under the surveillance equipment of the US and survived. So, I mean, it's ridiculous to say that either the UK or the US, the UK is funding the holding camps in the Northeast for ISIS. And yet they're stripping people like Begum of her citizenship. This is the hypocrisy. In my opinion, they don't want her to come back to the UK because her testimony is too dangerous. And this has been an ongoing thing. If you look at the case of Mozambique, for example, who was sent to Syria to train the jihadists and who came back to the UK and was put on trial, and the trial kind of collapsed. Why? Because MI6 were like, shit, we don't want people to know what he was doing there and that he was, doing it on our behalf. And there were multiple cases like that of people coming back who were put on trial and the trial just disappeared. It was just shoved under the carpet. And funnily enough, the people were just set free. Because the last thing, they didn't want to be fingered with having any role or any direct involvement. And the UK Foreign Office leaked documents that came out, I think a couple of years ago now, showed very clearly the UK Foreign Office involvement in creating media, in providing witnesses to corroborate so-called staged events like the chemical attacks and so on and so forth. I mean, they've been exposed in their role multiple times. But of course, what does the media do? It circles its wagons around the narrative and just keeps pushing it in the hope that most people are just going to kind of, yeah, right, okay, Assad gasses his own people, And they try to bury the research and the evidence that disproves mainstream narratives. They try to bury it, or they try to discredit, or they try to smear journalists like myself and Eva Bartlett, who were on the ground for, pretty much most of the war, and Sharmin Nawani, for example, who was in Syria from 2012 onwards.
Yeah, no, the example you gave of John Kerry there, I think is a great one. That's kind of, I always go to people with that one because you can hear him actually outright say it.
Let me ask you, Michael. I mean, I think we've been putting an extraordinary amount of arms in, haven't we?
Yeah, and I have to say, as you said, it's a double-edged sword because you give people the ability to defend themselves, but when you pump more weapons into a situation like Syria, it doesn't end well for Syrians because there's always somebody else that's willing to pump more weapons in for the other side. The groups, the armed groups in Syria get a lot of support, not just from the United States, but from other partners. And we've never said that
Qatar, Russia, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, huge amount of weapons coming in, huge amount of money.
But pumping weapons in causes someone else to pump more weapons in, and you end up with a level.
I mean, the reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. and we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength, and we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him.
For background for people, so he's basically meeting with a Syrian opposition group, and he's like, we watched ISIS grow, we thought we could manage, again, paraphrasing, he's like, we watched ISIS grow, we thought we could manage it, we thought we could use it as leverage, to basically change the regime in Syria. And then he goes on to say, the reason Russia came into the war is because it didn't want a Daesh and ISIS government. So that's why they came in. And that, that's in his words. And it's really interesting to see that only 3 media organizations, I think it's Reuters, The Guardian, and the New York Times, even mentioned about this leaked tape, but all 3 of them didn't mention that bit. And I went through the New York Times article where they play snippets. They play snippets of it. So I went to the full video and thought, okay, how close is that bit to that comment? And there's someone that were like just after and just before. So you're like, they purposely left that out, the juiciest story ever. Like the US government, who went to all these wars apparently over what happened in 9/11, is now watching ISIS grow so it can overthrow another government that it doesn't like. It would have been the biggest story ever, but nothing. Only 3. I think it was, Reuters, The Guardian, no, CNN, that was it. CNN posted the whole video and then they took it down, I'm sure, for that reason. But that is a great example. You can also hear Israeli, officials, military, or the Mossad talk about how they basically rather back Al-Qaeda against Syria.
They even said ISIS. They even said they would prefer an ISIS regime to a Bashar al-Assad government. And the other one, of course, was even under the Trump administration, everyone kind of perceives Trump to have been less of a warlord than the Democrat Party, but actually that's really not true in the case of Syria, because Trump brought in, for example, the Caesar sanctions based on the totally fraudulent Caesar Caesar files, that again were orchestrated. People should think back to, what was it, the Kuwaiti incubator babies, the Viagra rape in Benghazi, the women's rights in Afghanistan. How are women's rights doing right now, 20 years after US departure from Afghanistan? You can safely assume that every single narrative that takes you to war, including the current ones with China, anything relating to Russia, North Korea, are all completely false. And if you work on that premise and actually, do some of your own research, particularly look at who's always behind these narratives, who's controlling them, who's providing the reports, who's providing the evidence, and that'll generally lead you back to US State Department or UK Foreign Office or MI6 or CIA. This is the thing. And the problem is that people have a sort of a groundhog thing going on. So now everyone's sort of figured out Syria. It took them quite a long time, I think, until around 2016 when consensus started to flip, when Aleppo was liberated and suddenly everyone saw that what me and Eva and other people who were actually on the ground had been saying was vindicated. It was even vindicated by UN reports. So people suddenly started going, oh, okay, maybe they're right. Now we're having the same thing again about Russia and Ukraine. We're having the same thing about China because they're selling the whole kind of Uyghur oppression narrative. They're selling the Hong Kong narrative. And people are kind of falling for it all over again. They're selling the Taiwan narrative, totally ignoring the one China commitment, just as they ignored the Minsk agreements. And they've now admitted that the Minsk agreements were just to allow them to weaponize the fascist elements in Ukraine in order to attack Russia, basically, right? And that's exactly what they did, for example, when Aleppo was under siege by the terrorist groups. And you mentioned the Free Syrian Army. I want to talk to people about the Free Syrian Army because basically the Free Syrian Army are the Muslim Brotherhood elements in Syria. And if you go back, as I said, in history, the Muslim Brotherhood itself, the Ikhwan, was created by Britain, British intelligence agencies in Egypt in the late 30s. And since then, it's been perceived as the political arm of Islam. But actually what it is a bunch of terrorists in suits. Fundamentally, that's it. And they've been weaponized against governments that, as we've mentioned, are non-compliant with Western values, with Western agendas. The majority of governments in Syria that were overthrown by black ops or clandestine operations since 1946. And under Hafez al-Assad, of course, everyone talks about the massacre of Hama in 1982, when apparently Hafez al-Assad cracked down on the rebels then, which were Muslim Brotherhood. But what nobody knows about is the years that went before that of suicide bombings, of civilian assassinations, of random attacks on civilian infrastructure, of the massacre of military cadets at the Aleppo military academy, where the Muslim Brotherhood entered, lined up all the Alawite and all the Shia Muslim cadets for execution. And the majority of the Sunni Muslim cadets joined them, said, if you're going to shoot our comrades, you shoot all of us. And they shot all of them. Nobody knows these stories because the media completely erases them, just as they erased all of the massacres that were carried out by the armed groups against civilians. And you know, the ethnic cleansing programs that were carried out by Wahhabi and Muslim Brotherhood extremists. And when, for example, I entered the districts of Eastern Aleppo immediately after liberation, the stories I heard about what the Free Syrian Army did to civilians in this area. Kids were being executed because their dads were in the army. People that didn't agree with them were being crucified. Christians were being crucified, literally crucified. People were being buried underground in underground tunnels and basically concreted in until they died. You know, there's mountains of testimony of what the Free Syrian Army did to people who previously were their neighbors. In many of the Christian towns like Malula, the Free Syrian Army carried out some of the worst atrocities against Christians who had welcomed them into their communities, even before they merged with Al-Qaeda. And from the very early stages, they were collaborating with ISIS. That's all documented. And even Robert Ford, who has a history of creating death squads, including in Nicaragua, alongside Negroponte, although he denies it. Also in Iraq, he denies that. Also, we've had various private message exchanges. Even he admitted that the Free Syrian Army really shouldn't have talked about their collaboration with ISIS, like so early on in the conflict. So the whole, you know, for me, I always say this, there's actually no difference between any of these armed groups. They are constantly rebranded because that confuses people in the West. You know, they become HTS, or they become Ara al-Sham, or Jabhat Shamia, or there's a multitude of names I can come up with. But effectively, it's like a mafia operation. They all have the same extremist ideology. They are all racist and sectarian. They all will work in collaboration until it comes to competition over money, over drugs, over trafficking, over territory, over status, over power, etc. Then they will clash. But basically, for example, the Kurdish Contras in the northeast that are also under the control of the youth, they collaborate with ISIS. They marry ISIS brides. They benefit from the corruption of being in charge of the holding camps of ISIS. You know, people need to understand war, and this kind of war is so dirty. It's so dirty. People will sell their mother for money, you know. And that's basically what it comes down to here.
Yeah, no, you've obviously been there many times and you live there, so I'd love to get, you know, some of your thoughts on living there later, but also, as you mentioned, you know, the atrocities. But before we get there, just to make clear to people, you know, the line about obviously moderate rebels, did anyone really actually take it that serious at the time? Like, was it just that obvious that,
No, everyone took it really seriously. Everyone in the West was completely duped on this. Everyone, if you look at how CNN, BBC were portraying these monsters, they are monsters, these armed groups. Really, I can't stress this enough. If I talk to you about some of the things that they did in Homs or in Latakia, it's actually hard for people to register or even stomach. It's hard for me to hear it. But it was unbelievable. It's not even Islamist, extremist, it's satanic. Some of the stories that are told to you by survivors of their occupation, what they did to their relatives and so on. It's horrendous. And so this idea, and of course it was reinforced by Charles Lister of, the Brookings Institute, who created this whole report trying to basically sell the idea. And David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, ran with it, that there were 70,000 identified moderate rebels inside Syria. He's actually now, I think, gone on Twitter and kind of totally undermined his own story. I don't think he even realized he did it, but of course everyone screenshot the tweet before he could delete it, if he did delete it. But no, it was nonsense, but people in the West fell for it completely. And they were hearing all these stories about Assad personally torturing and killing his own civilians. There was the Amnesty International report about Sadnaya prison, where it was talking about, I can't even remember the numbers, they were so ridiculous. And the former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, went on various interviews and said, this is ridiculous. This prison holds some of the most violent, extremist, Al-Qaeda type prisoners, and it only holds maximum 500. I think they were talking 5,000. And in the end, Amnesty had to basically back down because they realized that everyone had figured out that it was all computer generated. They hadn't actually gone to Sadnaya. I mean, and the thing is, where Sadnaya is, it's right next to the Christian communities who are perfectly happy for those Al-Qaeda monsters to be in prison and not released to continue the atrocities against them. None of this context is ever introduced by Western media. The BBC has done the most criminal job on reporting in Syria. And I actually bumped into Lise Doucet, who's the senior BBC Middle East correspondent in the Ministry of Media in Damascus. And she refuses to remember this conversation, but I will repeat it. And I asked her, I basically said, why is the BBC not investigating the White Helmets, the MI6 incubated organization that is embedded with the armed groups and is providing the propaganda to basically protect the image of those armed groups? And she turned around, she said, it's too polarizing and too controversial. And I looked at her, I said, I'm sorry, you are a media company, right? Like, isn't that your job? If the British government is funding an organization that is committing war crimes, is accused of organ trafficking rings, running organ trafficking rings, abducting children to stage chemical weapon events, and accused by Syrian civilians, shouldn't you be investigating it? She denies having that conversation basically now. But that's what the BBC represents. And of course, you've also got the 2013 BBC Panorama Saving Syria's Children, which was forensically investigated by Robert Stewart, a kind of citizen researcher, who pointed out, and I would totally agree with his conclusion, that it was entirely staged. And this was prior to the 2013 vote in Parliament to basically bomb Syria and to introduce the no-fly zone, which would have led to greater bloodshed. Even Hillary Clinton admitted that if they were to introduce a no-fly zone, then more Syrians would be killed, as they were in Libya, of course.
Yeah, no, obviously, as we discussed there, I'm happy to move on after this, but you can find, I'll put it in the show notes, I'll try to put stuff on the screen as well. Israeli, comments about them coming over the border, getting hospital treatment, no background check, just sticking back out there because they'd rather, the whole country just bleeds each other out, ISIS, Al Qaeda. You can find obviously the John Kerry clip. You can find numerous articles where they're saying we should back al-Nusra, it's the strongest force, or, the Free Syrian Army ends up just giving up their weapons to them anyway, or working with them because of the stronger force. And even if you don't obviously want to believe we back them, obviously ISIS and Al Qaeda took massive swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, directly the cause of that. So, being there in Syria many times and obviously living there, what is actually the view there of Assad himself, and then obviously the West? Has the war basically increased the view of him? Like, has it differed much from before, or have they always been kind of with him?
No, I mean, if you go back even to 2011, of course, what the media did also was to erase the vast million-strong or hundreds of thousands strong protests in support of President Assad. Of course, that was never shown. And Jonathan Steele in 2012 for The Guardian, before all the good journalists were kicked off The Guardian and they just introduced a bunch of spooks, basically, in my opinion. Jonathan Steele wrote about it. He said what the media is not telling you is how popular Bashar al-Assad is in Syria. And he talked about various polls that have been carried out, I think, in Doha, which, as I pointed out, is not exactly friendly to Syria, but it still came up with a 52%, I think 52% or around that, popularity rating for President Assad, which is higher than most Western leaders, especially now. I mean, look at Macron in France. I think he'd struggle to get above 25 right now. So all of that was ignored. And there is a video of Lise Doucet in Damascus very early on, I think in 2012, and she's being harangued by Syrian civilians saying, what the hell are you doing here? We don't want your democracy. We love our president. You're lying. You're lying about what is going on here. Sorry, electricity went off. And really, that hasn't changed. 85 or let's say 80% of Syria is back under control of the Syrian government and the Syrian forces, allied forces. And we had elections here in May 2021, and I actually wrote about that, and I said what these elections were about. It's not about re-electing President Assad. It's about telling the West, you're irrelevant. You're not going to dictate to us who is our president, who is our government, how we live our life, who is in charge of us. Even with your sanctions, even though we're exhausted, we're still going to come out and celebrate our president. And on the night of the elections, this is a guy who is supposedly hated by all his people, went out without security with his wife and kids to one of the busiest areas of Damascus, Maidan, for shawarma. And he's completely mobbed by people wherever he goes. This president didn't leave the country even when ISIS were less than 2 kilometers away from his residence, right? Despite everything they've thrown at him, the potential for assassination, he goes to most places with no security, none. You don't see them. He's in amongst the people, and he's literally being mobbed. The same with his wife, the same with his kids, right? And his kids were brought up in this environment. They're some of the most humble kind of kids of sovereign leaders that you'll ever see on film, meeting people, going to the homes of martyrs, going to various disaster areas, particularly after the earthquake in February of this year, for example. The reality is that actually President Assad, of course people criticize the government as they would in any country in the world, and they don't stop. People talk about police state here. You can get in taxis, you can go to restaurants, you can talk to the street sweeper, you can talk to the guy in the kiosk on the street. They will all complain to you about no electricity, no fuel, no there's the government, that, openly, right? But the president is a red line for everyone. They do actually adore him. And, you know, that is evident from whenever he goes out. I remember in 2018, he just wandered down the street to one of the government subsidized shops, totally on his own with like his hands in his pockets, and just walked into the shop. And people nearly died of shock. Everyone wanted to take selfies. Everyone wanted, you know. He regularly goes out in an unmarked car, his car, late at night and just drives around Damascus alone with no security.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point there, obviously, because we always look at it as, oh, they've got a terrible approving rating or they're protesters. And then you look at our own governments. Most people don't really care about voting. The approval rating's tiny. We protest all the time, as you said, like Macron, France, perfect example. You know, people always make the comments like, imagine if, you know, Russia or, you know, Middle Eastern country was like, look at the protests going there, we need to overthrow the government. Or, yeah, like you said, they call them a police state. But then, you know, we get all the revelations about the national security state and tech companies working together to surveil us. So everything you say to them is like, and then they, you know, he gets a high, you know, approval rating. They're like, you know, it's a fraud. You know, it's not real. It's really crazy to think about, you know, everything we project on them. You know, literally most people are just uninterested in politics. And, you know.
Exactly. And the thing is, I think it was John Pilger that said, you know, we should stop looking over there and start looking here at what's happening in our country. You know, the power grab that's going on, the war against the working class, the total eradication of freedom, human rights. You know, we are living in a far more totalitarian, or rather you are, I'm not right now, you are living in a far more totalitarian, borderline fascist state than I am in Syria, or in Russia, or in Iran even. I spent 2 weeks in Iran earlier this year. You know, when I look at France and I look at the number of, I was in France in 2019 and I went on the Gilets jaunes protest. It was terrifying what the police were doing to their own civilians. I mean, people were losing eyes, they were losing limbs, they were losing hands. And that's been going on since 2018-19, but nobody is saying, kick Macron out. And he's hated. He has to be one of the most unpopular presidents ever in France. I mean, they're calling for the guillotine in the protest.
Yeah, I even say if you know, a dictator or president in another country, even if they was, say, you know, more unpopular, when you go there and bomb them and try and overthrow the government, all it means is people are going to get behind them. Like, I mean, 9/11 is the perfect example. Like George W. Bush's, you know, approval rating, the fact he could go to these wars, it's all based off, you know, a trauma event. So everyone roused up, where, you know, and then as soon as that kind of trauma's gone, the approval rating goes down, all the other presidents. But I'm a bit, unless you want to comment on that, you know, we haven't got loads left, and I did promise to talk about the current events. So, you know, either we can get into, you know, the current affairs of, you know, Syria, the sanctions, the occupation, or, you know, we could go more into the normalization of the Arab League, or we could do both, depending, you know, we still got at least 10 minutes. So take your pick, I guess.
I think what's important, because people have been very kind of pivoted towards what's going on in Ukraine, and they've been whipped up into a kind of anti-Russia frenzy by the media and government agencies and so on, which is just extraordinary. And so people have sort of, to a degree, lost interest in Syria, because Syria is not, you know, it's not headline news anymore, as it was during the height of the regime change war against Syria. And so what people maybe don't realize, and I'll try to kind of condense it so that they have a picture of what Syrian people are living through. Basically, Syria now is a centralized territory which is surrounded on almost all sides by hostile states that have annexed parts of Syrian territory. So in the northwest, you have the Al-Qaeda sort of derivatives and their affiliates in control of the northwest and Idlib. In the north, you have Turkish military. Turkish military is also, of course, in the northwest, aiding and abetting the armed groups there that are basically under Turkish control. But Turkey itself has annexed territory, even putting up a kind of apartheid wall very similar to what you see in Israel, actually separating Syrian territory from Syria under the control of Turkish militia. And also Turkey has taken control of all the Muslim Brotherhood elements. Again, they've been rebranded multiple times. I think they're now the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which is under the control of Turkey, which was previously the Free Syrian Army. This is what they do. They kind of rebrand everything, so people just goes, oh, it's too complicated. I can't keep up with it, whatever, you know. And they just sort of go back to the, yeah, Assad's bad, doesn't matter what happens. So that's the north. Then the northeast, you basically have US occupation, both direct, they have around 2,000 troops, between 24 and 28 illegal military bases. They just established a new military base in central Syria close to Raqqa, which they pulverized in theory in the war against ISIS, but basically it was to ethnically cleanse the whole area so that they could settle with the Kurdish separatists that are under the control of the US and Israel in the northeast. And Victoria Nuland has been making noises quite recently about creating an autonomous region in the northeast of Syria. So the Balkanization of Syria again. And in that area, so the US and the Kurdish Contras basically have control of all Syrian oil resources, pretty much, and agricultural resources. And they have control of the main borders between Iraq and Syria. And they regularly bomb any humanitarian convoys that are coming in from Iraq, particularly after the earthquake, to prevent humanitarian aid coming to the Syrian government for distribution to the earthquake victims. Both Israel and US are regularly bombing those convoys, claiming, of course, that they're full of weapons, which is completely hypocritical because that's what they were doing in the early stages of the war, sending weapons in through World Food Programme and other such NGO convoys. And added to that, America is basically regularly killing civilians, kidnapping civilians. It is, as I've said, transferring ISIS to different areas of Syria to carry out attacks on Syrian army positions. Even after the earthquake, there were two major ISIS attacks, of course orchestrated by the US against civilians to the east of Homs, when hundreds of civilians were murdered and hundreds were kidnapped. And we don't know where those kidnapped victims are or what the US is doing with them. Then in the east and southeast, you again have US military occupation. So they have the Al Tanf military base, which has a 55-kilometer exclusion zone in which they are recruiting and training armed groups, including ISIS, in the use of artillery, like, for example, the HIMARS system, which has a maximum range of about 300 kilometers. So from there, they can effectively target Damascus if they want to. And Israel uses the Al Tanf base to often launch its attacks against Syria. We had one last night, actually, on Damascus at around midnight. They targeted the south of Damascus and western Damascus, so very near me. And then, of course, in the south, you have Israel, who illegally annexed the Golan territories in '67 in the Six-Day War. But that had been pre-planned before the Six-Day War. Planned to take Jordanian territory, the Sinai and Gaza from Egypt, and the Golan territories. Why? Because 30% of Israeli water comes from Golan territories. It's actually not about oil. This is about natural resources other than oil. Oil is involved, but water is more important. Then to the west, you do have Lebanon, but Lebanon has been put into economic freefall, which again has impacted on Syria because many Syrian businessmen, to try and keep their money safe, transferred it to Lebanon when the war kicked off and when many of them were put under sanctions. And then, of course, in the last 2-3 years, since the Beirut port blast in 2019, the economy has collapsed, orchestrated by the US and UK. And therefore, that's cut off Lebanon as being a sort of relatively friendly border country for Syria. Jordan Jordan has reopened trade with Syria, but Jordan is still considered as a sort of vassal state, particularly of Britain. And then effectively, so with the US occupying the oil, that means here in Syria, we don't have any of our resources. We don't have oil. So we don't have fuel for cars. We don't have heating fuel. We don't have electricity. We don't have internet a lot of the time because the generators don't work. Businesses are closing because they don't have electricity. Hospitals can't operate effectively. Hospitals can't replace equipment because of sanctions. So people are not being operated on. People can't leave because they can't get visas in other countries because of, you know, the hostility towards Syrians, basically, that's fed by the Western media. So life here, and Caesar sanctions that were brought in under the Trump administration have crippled any sort of rebuilding assistance from other countries, because basically what the Caesar sanctions do is any country that comes to the aid of Syria, it's going to get punitive sanctions against them also for simply working with Syria. And now, of course, they're trying to bring in further sanctions because of the Captagon drug production that they're claiming is going on in Syria, even though the West actually supplied Captagon in Libya and in the majority of its conflict zones that it created, you know. So the misery that the Syrian people are living through is off the scale. I would only put Yemen as being in a worse state of affairs than Syria.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't imagine it in the slightest how horrible it'd be. But I mean, think about how annoyed people get. You know, right now in the UK, I have a Shell garage that's round the corner, and obviously the price of petrol has been very high, and the cost of living crisis, and people go mad about that. You know, rightly so. But imagine putting yourself in the shoes of a country. I always thought, you know, if someone tried to sanction us because of what Tony Blair and George Bush did, people would go mad. They'd be like, that was out of our control. But we treat other countries like it's their fault. They need to overthrow Saddam Hussein. They need to throw them because they're, you know, partly guilty. And all it takes is some high petrol prices here, and, you know, people go livid. So I couldn't even imagine it there. And, you know, to kind of back you up, there was a US government official, I think in 2019, called Dana Stroll, and she was and she basically says, you know, we are using the sanctions to basically, you know, crush them. The US military owns, use the word owns, a third of Syrian territory, which, you know, where their hydrocarbons are and their wheat, which has a lot of talk in Washington. She says we can, you know, block people from opening embassies to normalize relations, and of course block reconstruction of Syria, which she describes as rubble.
Still holds from our report or your reflections in light of recent decisions in terms of the sources of U.S. leverage, next steps that we should be taking?
So first, I'm just going to give you the 1 minute spiel on what the report did recommend prior to the last month's decisions and developments. We argued in our recommendation section that taken as a whole, even though the United States said there's limited appetite domestically here or on the Hill to match the level of resources or even diplomatic investment of the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, that the United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So I guess kind of on the closing kind of question, because I know you've got an interview soon. Obviously, they have kind of failed to block the normalization of relations in, the Arab League. So if you just want to talk on that, but you give me an hour, so I don't want to make you run over too much.
Yeah, I mean, basically now, of course, what they're trying to do is to prevent the normalization. I mean, President Assad was recently invited by Saudi Arabia to the Arab League. Sorry, one of the dogs is snoring really loudly. I don't know if you can hear him. He gave a pretty historic speech at the Arab League summit in Jeddah fairly recently. There's been normalization with Egypt. There's Iran and Russia are trying to broker talks between President Assad and President Erdogan of Turkey. That's sort of ground to a halt because Assad's red line is, Turkey's just basically got to get out of Syria and then he might talk, which is perfectly reasonable. And of course, ooh?
I'm still here.
Oh, okay.
Camera is my camera.
Okay. And so basically what has the US done? It's now brought in, it's proposed a bill, what is it called? The anti-normalization bill, which is going to try and prevent people, again, it's going to punish people for normalizing relations with President Assad, blah, 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 blah. But actually, the thing is, with what's going on in the world today, with the pivot towards the East anyway, and the war in Ukraine, the collaboration now, or the heightened collaboration between Russia and China, African countries starting to push back against US colonization, basically, and French colonization, British colonization, and saying, you had South African politicians and officials saying, we are not going to abandon our relations with Russia. And actually one guy, I think he was an opposition member, said, yeah, we're prepared to arm Russia in Ukraine, which nearly killed, what's his name, Saka of BBC Hard Talk. I mean, he had nowhere to go after that, right? And with the pivot towards the East and the de-dollarization that's going on, and Marco Rubio said fairly recently, shit, if this de-dollarization goes on, what can we do? We don't have our economic warfare anymore. It's not going to be successful. So shit, what do we do? What do we do to put pressure on the countries that are not coming into line, right? They're buried in a military quagmire in Ukraine. They're pouring weapons into Ukraine. And I'm quite sure the majority of these countries in the EU and even the UK don't have weapons to defend themselves even anymore, if they really have provided those armaments to Ukraine. Of course, many of them are ending up in the Sahel and Africa and so on, and probably also in Syria in the northwest. And so therefore, the West is terrified of this normalization process. And what's happening actually is a commodity bloc is forming because, of course, all the countries that are kind of lining up behind Russia and China are the countries with the resources. And it's leaving the West with what? All the countries that they've pillaged and plundered and pirated and destroyed and savaged for all these years are suddenly going, no, hold on. Now we have countries that have the same vision as us, behind whom we can stand and who will stand by us, right? And so we're living through, in my view, a very transformational time. I have no idea where it's going to end up because I'm quite sure the US, UK is not going to give up on its various supremacist agendas. But we're definitely, and Syria is kind of really central to what's going on because Syria is the gateway to Eurasia. And of course, the big new Brzezinski wrote about that they would have a very small window of opportunity to get control of Eurasia. And they've kind of failed in Syria. Syria was sort of the last domino before Iran to be destroyed, to be knocked over. And it's failed. What it's actually done, pan-Arabism is coming back to the fore, which they've spent decades trying to destroy. The relationship between Syria and Russia is stronger than ever. The relationship between Russia and China and Iran is stronger than ever. So everything that they were trying to prevent is actually coming to fruition. You know, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, it's pretty mind-boggling, you know, kind of what they try to achieve and what's actually happening. And again, you know, there's like a clip every day you see of, you know, an African official just like, we're done with, like, we're just done with this. We don't care what you say. You know, we're such in a bubble in the West, you know, compared to what people think. They just don't think the same at all. But again, you know, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Do you want to tell people, you know, where to find yourself, your work, and then, you know, feel free to jump on.
Mostly these days people can subscribe or please, if possible, donate to my Substack. I'm also on Patreon, I'm sort of clinging on, and YouTube, Telegram, my Telegram channel, and Twitter. You know, for as long as they last, I'm always waiting for the censorship axe to fall, but so far I've survived.
Yeah, no, I'll put all of your links in the show notes. I'll get some of it on the screen. But again, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate your time. I recommend people check out your work, check out, you know, your interviews. You've done, you know, loads, you've done talks, you know, about the white helmets we didn't get into. The cover in Syria, Iraq, you can never get to it. So I just encourage people to, you know, go out there and look. And I'll, again, put as much as I can in the show notes. But thank you for coming on. And I hope you enjoy your next interview, which is very short. So I will finally let you go.
Thanks, Lewin. Thanks for doing what you're doing. It's really important for you know, people coming up into the world that we're living in right now to get a better handle on what's been happening. So thank you for what you're doing also.
That's okay. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them.
Now let's look at this clip with Charlie Robinson and Whitney Webb.
Right. So Erick Prince is best known, as you brought them up already, for being the guy behind Blackwater, which has undergone a few transformations since it was named Blackwater. I think now it's Academy, and I think it's actually owned by Apollo Global Management, Leon Black, funny enough.
Black.
Yeah.
I wonder if he negotiated those deals over at Epstein's house.
Yeah, well, as we'll get to in a second, if you talk about Epstein and the Iran-Contra network and look at Erick Prince and, what that network is today, maybe there's something there, but don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So anyway, Erick Prince, left Blackwater when it was really infamous, and then it underwent those name changes, and he sort of tried to distance himself from it. And has been involved pretty much ever since then in lobbying the U.S. federal government to privatize various other war efforts, most recently in Ukraine, where he was trying to sort of pitch his services to both sides. So not just like the U.S., right, but also the Wagner Group of Russia. And then, of course, before then was trying to push for privatization of the Afghanistan conflict, and also I think AFRICOM stuff, basically U.S. military operations in Africa. And at that same time, he also got increasingly involved with Chinese state-owned companies through his Frontier Services Group. And some of the subsidiaries of that, and it was sold, the main owner of that, while Prince was running it, was CITIC, which is I think the largest Chinese state-owned conglomerate, but obviously a lot of ties to the CCP there. And then, of course, it gets weird when you consider that Erick Prince has long been very close to Trump land, which is supposed to be very anti-CCP. And why are they so welcoming of this guy? We can get into why that might be later. But essentially, Erick Prince is this operative, I guess I would say, and he's sort of, it's been forgotten, I guess you could say, that he was very close to the CIA while he ran Blackwater, and is a documented CIA asset, at least until 2010. But you could argue probably later than that. And at the very least, he's definitely come under the influence, or under the pay, he might be on the payroll. Probably both, of Israeli intelligence, which is sort of what this article is about, because he got involved with this woman who you mentioned earlier, Lital Lashem, who is provably part of this Epstein Ehud Barak network of Israeli intelligence. Obviously most intelligence agencies, have factionalism within them, competing power factions, like every other part of the quote unquote deep state in any country, really, because every country essentially has one, right? So that's essentially who he's teamed up with, and you have him getting involved with what appears to be a front company for Israeli intelligence that's exploiting loopholes to sell Israeli defenseware and arms and other things to the U.S., even though a lot of things produced abroad, or certain sensitive electronics and things like that, have to be produced in the U.S., or at least, by U.S. corporations for national security purposes. And this company is essentially loopholing all of that. So that's sort of a bird's eye view. I mean, there's a lot more detail there that we can go into wherever you'd like to start.
Yeah. So we've got Frontier Research Group, which is his Africa China investment.
Sort of,
group.
yeah. It's about securing mineral resources and other resources for China within Africa. And this is interesting too, because ostensibly the U.S. is competing for those same resources within mineral Africa. Resources and other and so he's backing one side, but also playing the other side of groups, like the Make America Great Again. The U.S. is competing for those factions, right? Who ostensibly wants that for the U.S., and he's selling it to the other side.
Is this part of Belt and Road Initiative? then? Because
It's
he's
tied
in
up
there.
with Belt and Road, who ostensibly wants that for the U.S. So he's openly been facilitating that. Erick
This is
Prince.
Thanks for watching that clip. If you want to hear the entire episode in audio format, just go wherever podcasts are served, search for macroaggressions, subscribe to the show, and please rate it when you get a chance. Thanks, everybody. That clip. If you want to hear the entire
Next, we will take a look at this interview with James Corbett of the Corbett Report.
Search for macroaggressions, subscribe to the show, and please rate it when you get a chance. Thanks, everybody. If you want to hear the
Next, we will take a look at this interview with James Corbett of the Corbett Report.
Search for macroaggressions, subscribe to the show, and please rate it.
Hi everyone, this is Veronica Kirilenko of the New American Magazine. We're in Bath, UK, covering the Better Way Conference, hosted and organized by the World Council for Health. And here with us today we have a very exciting guest, James Corbett, an award-winning investigative journalist, writer, and producer and host of the Corbett Report. James, it's so good to see you. I would like to ask you first this. You've been researching and investigating the emergence of the biosecurity state and weaponization of healthcare for at least a couple of decades, if I'm not mistaken. So please tell us about your professional interest in this subject.
So it started back in the later part of the 2000s, so 2008, 2009. I started investigating biosecurity in medical martial law and other such terms that were not very popular at that time. Not a lot of people knew about them, but I saw in the wake of the 2001, not only of course 9/11, but the anthrax attacks, that there was a weaponization of the biosecurity state that was taking place. And the laying into law, the legislative framework for medical martial law, medical lockdowns, quarantines, forced inoculations, all of that was being put into place methodically through a legislative process. In the United States specifically, but of course it was happening all over the world. And I was trying to ring the alarm bell about it at the time. So when I saw the development in 2014, Ebola, 2015, 16, Zika, these types of scares that were being raised by the World Health Organization over and over, the public health emergency of international concern that they declared, I again was trying to raise the alarms about that. It wasn't until 2020 that I think they actually pulled the trigger on that and really started going for the biosecurity state.
And what alarmed you?
It was the laying of the infrastructure that I saw that was taking place. So for example, in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic, which actually turned out to be a less deadly flu pandemic than regular flu season, but nonetheless was hyped up to be an incredible, important thing that we had to start shutting down. I was teaching schools at schools in Japan at that time. They were literally shutting down schools because they were afraid the children were going to get swine flu and all of this. They were, of course, hyping the vaccines. Of course, everyone had to get the flu shot for the swine flu at that time. And so when it started to come out, as the Council for Europe and the British Medical Journal, I believe it was, conducted a special investigation after the fact and discovered that indeed, yes, most of the people who were on the advisory board of the World Health Organization Advisory Council that advised them to declare this public health emergency of international concern for the swine flu, most of them had ties to the very pharmaceutical manufacturers who then directly benefited from that declaration by getting all of the contracts for of course, vaccines, Tamiflu, all of these types of pharmaceutical interventions that were predicated on that. So I saw this was a swindle that was happening over and over. And I also saw the laying of the Model Health State Emergency Powers Act, which had been, again, formulated in the wake of the anthrax attacks, and then passed in individual states all around the US. The majority of states now have passed some version of that legislation that literally allows governors to become essentially medical martial law dictators. So this was very concerning, and I knew that the development of bioweapons, all of this was happening in the background, and unfortunately, I foresaw something like what happened in the past few years happening. The thing that really surprised me about it was how much people accepted what happened, how quickly people just accepted the idea of lockdowns.
Yeah, this is interesting. So what's the underlying agenda of these developments? Because obviously it's a hard task with such a complicated, sophisticated architecture in place. lots of money involved. So they would say that, well, our environment breeds more and more deadly pathogens because of the climate change we're being told right now, or that we as the good guys need to be on top of biosecurity and develop these kinds of measures, countermeasures to protect our populations from bioterrorism. So do you see other forces and motives in play?
Absolutely. So the idea is to declare essentially emergencies of various sorts to justify things that could never be justified in times of non-emergency. And obviously the events of 9/11 were the terrorist emergency, which allowed for the formation of the Homeland Security complex. The events of the past few years are the justification, or at least supposedly the justification, for the laying of the biosecurity infrastructure. Next, we're going to have the climate emergency. And all of these emergencies are going to merge in various ways. Bioterrorism, of course, can be merged quite easily, and we've seen the specter of that being raised. Also the climate emergency and climate lockdowns, and all of these ideas start to merge into one thing. It reveals, I think, what this is really about, which of course is not about protecting public or promoting actual health. It's about finding ways to institute more and more centralized control over humanity. And the ultimate, I think, where this is ultimately heading, although it sounds crazy and science fiction-esque, I think this really is heading towards some sort of transhumanist push for more and more mechanical interventions in our bodies of biomedical nature. Eventually, the brain chip and the merging of humanity with machines is, I think, the goal that is being driven towards.
One of the hottest topics of this conference is the protection of individual and national sovereignty in context of the WHO's attempts to expand its powers. So what are the key legal developments that people need to be aware of?
I think people need to understand, first and foremost right now, with regards to the World Health Organization and what it is pushing, there are two parallel processes that are happening right now. One is a push for a treaty of some sort, although they won't call it a treaty because treaties have to be ratified by various member states and what have you. They're going to call it a convention or an agreement of some sort, which will then be automatically implemented in every WHO member state, which is basically the entire world. At the same time, they're also amending the International Health Regulations, which is a legal document that is part of the World Health Organization. It's been passed in and amended in multiple forms over the years, but the latest iteration was in 2005, after SARS Part 1, the original scare back in 2003, there was a push to amend the International Health Regulations to make them more powerful, more effective, more teeth, essentially. And that's what created the concept of the public health emergency of international concern, which is this declaration that the World Health Organization Director General can make unilaterally, actually, as it turns out. In fact, we saw that with monkeypox, the monkeypox scare last year. The Advisory Council was actually majority against advising the Director General to declare a public health emergency over that. He declared it anyway. So what that does is institute a lot of this framework for the biosecurity state that we've been talking about. They are now attempting to amend those international health regulations to make them even more binding and even more strict on various national governments, to give World Health Organization more power to bring in what Bill Gates has called pandemic firefighting teams that will be able to go into any spot where there seems to be something developing and start the lockdowns, inoculations, whatever they need to do. So this is the vision that we're moving towards. It's happening in this parallel process that's happening mostly behind closed doors. There's some fig leaf of some public participation, but that doesn't mean anything. They don't have to actually implement anything that the public says. These are unelected officials that have incredible control over people's lives, as we've seen in the past few years. Most people don't even know this process is happening. And even if and when they do discover that it's happening, there is very, very, very little recourse for the average person involved in this. Essentially, if your country is a member of the World Health Organization, which basically every state on the planet is, you will automatically be subject to these provisions once they are passed, unless your government puts specifically into writing, no, we object to this and we are not going to follow this.
But not every country is on board with this.
No, there are signs of resistance, and in fact, I was very heartened to see just a couple of weeks ago, even on the steps of the Capitol, there were a group of congressmen that were talking about pulling out of the WHO altogether. That is the type of rhetoric that we at least need to be starting to hear, and it is good that we are starting to hear it, but I think there needs to be a much more broad, widespread social movement. People have to be aware that this is happening. People have to be aware of the importance of it. People have to be pushing this. Politicians love to get out in front of a parade and pretend that they started it. So if we form the parade, we must exit the WHO. There will be politicians who, even just to preserve their own political future, will get out in front and start waving that flag.
Well, the ideology that surrounds it, it serves as the basis of seems very deeply inhumane, because James, think about that. They want to centralize power essentially to save us from ourselves, because if climate change is driven by human activity, then we are the footprint, the carbon footprint they're trying to reduce.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, it's not just inhumane; it's anti-human. This is a fundamentally anti-human agenda, and it's predicated on the idea that we are essentially useless eaters. All we do is emit carbon, and we are just a burden on the planet. And that mindset is truly what we are facing. And the worst part about that is, of course, I understand why oligarchs who want to rule over the planet would have that mindset and would try to inculcate that. But the fact that the public has swallowed that so much and believe that humans are a cancer on the planet, and there are too many people, we have to get rid of a bunch of people. People are starting to adopt that. To the point where there are, of course, people who are voluntarily, I'm not going to have children, I don't want to be a burden on the planet. Well, of course, that is every individual's choice to make. But I would hope that people are making it based on their own understanding of the world, and not something that's being foisted upon them by a truly predatory elitist class that want to rule over people and want them to desire their own death.
Why people turned out to be so gullible? It's really surprising, because in the West, people are usually very intelligent, very educated, and you'd expect them to see them the root cause and the agenda that drives it. I think it's on the surface, but apparently it's not. So many people would just believe what they hear on the news.
Unfortunately so, and to be fair, I think there have been hundreds of years of very finely tuned propaganda and psychological experimentation. I think with each iteration of these great catastrophic catalyzing events, there is more information that the would-be ruling elite have about human nature, human psychology, how people respond to these types of situations, and how they can be manipulated into believing the next one. And so I think the machinery of propaganda gets more refined with each iteration. You can look back 100 years ago. Edward Bernays literally wrote the book on propaganda and talking about the intelligent manipulation of the organized habits of society is the people who do that constitute the real ruling power of this country. That was true 100 years ago. How much more true is it today? So I don't want to look at the people who have been hit by the baseball bat and crippled and then laugh at them for being crippled. No, the public has been intellectually crippled and put into this ideological viewpoint where they're desiring their own enslavement. I think it is the job of people who understand this to be the light, to show to people, no, the human species is wonderful and dynamic, and we truly can solve our problems. We do not need this predatory, parasitic class on top that are preying upon us to control us, manage us, lock us down, quarantine us, put us into databases, scan us, track us everywhere we go. That is a fundamentally anti-human thing. And I think once people understand it in that context, they will resist against it. I think that as long as the human spirit exists, there will be resistance.
James, I would like to thank you so much for this important conversation. Please tell us, what is the best way to follow you in your work?
Well, I have been censored and scrubbed from a number of platforms, so in the event that happens with any of the platforms I'm on right now, you can always find me at corbettreport.com.
Thank you so much.
Last but not least, let's take a look at this interview with Ryan, Cristian, and Derrick Broze.
Now, the next part is very important. The fluoride info war Derrick recently wrote about. Newly released emails show California dental director alter study to remove negative conclusions. Very important. This should be international news because of how obvious this person is on the record telling you his job as a dentist is to promote fluoridation. His job is to undermine this information. He even says that at one point, his whole point is to basically, I forget the word they use, but to preempt, that's what he said, the study that they already know is ready to come out. So what it shows you is an effort to, behind the scenes, cobble together some kind of science dispute or some kind of scientific study to use against the report they're holding back. The report that's been ready for 3 years that tells you, which we've now proven, that fluoride is toxic, that is hurting people, that is lowering children IQs. So they go, pause, hold on. And in the background, as we just found out, they're over here going, quick, how do we put this together? How to make this look like this? And how do we, and they find out, that shows that's a problem. Well, let's alter the study findings so we can make it look like it's not. That's real. Caught. This applies to every aspect of the scientific manipulation we're experiencing today. So let's go now to Derrick for an update on this very important story. Welcome, Derrick. Give us the recent updates on the fluoride trial and the recent developments with the emails, which I really hope people will focus more on because I think it's one of the biggest developments so far in what we've seen. You're muted, brother.
Okay, it is 9 a.m. All right, so the emails that we're talking about today, it's really just the continuation of the fluoride trial that's been going on since 2020 that we've been covering. And as I think we reported on the show, and I know I reported in a recent article, the trial is going to pick back up in January 2024. So there's just kind of procedural hearings going on, and that includes the Fluoride Action Network attorneys, Michael Connett. He filed some more open records requests, as we covered in previous interviews, where they filed open records requests, FOIA requests with the CDC, HHS, and other departments, and that's where we found out that Assistant Health Secretary Rachel Levine is the one who, or at least the emails claim, blocked the release of this NTP report that found that fluoride does cause lower IQ in children. And, so that was been controversial all on its own. Unfortunately, that hasn't even got enough attention. Mm-hmm. Now we have a new set of emails, and this relates to the California State Dental Director. His name's Dr. Jayath Kumar. And again, Fluoride Action Network, Michael Connett, they filed public records request in California to try to get emails from this doctor, specifically relating to a study that came out just in the last 2 years, which found the exact opposite. As we've been saying, it found that there is no association between fluoride and lower IQ in children. And this study, of course, just happened to come out while we were waiting for new information during the fluoride trial. And at the recent hearings we covered, where the judge did set the trial date for 2024, this specific study, authored in part by Dr. Jayath Kumar, who again is California State Dental Director, this study was used by the EPA and the government to say, hey, look, there's new information we have, and this new information doesn't conclude what the plaintiffs are arguing. So, I just want to set that stage before we show you the background of this study, because again, the government is using this specific study by this specific doctor from dentist from California to say, pay no attention to those previous studies that we've discussed in this case. Let's pay attention to this 2021 study because it finds that there is no association between fluoride and lower IQ in children.
One quick point. Go ahead, finish your thought.
I was going to say, because of that, that's why these open records requests were filed, because this study and this doctor are relevant to the overall trial.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I mean, obviously, new information should be considered. No one should disregard that. But what I said, it's not really new. It's 2021. But what's interesting, though, is this is the same thing we see, as our audience will be well aware of, during COVID-19, or masks are a great example, where we have what is considered the top of the pyramid of empirical evidence, whether, expert opinions actually being the lowest level. People don't realize that. Systematic review of peer-reviewed science and random controlled trials. In 2020, the CDC did their own meta-analysis of all these studies, finding it was not statistically significant in reducing transmission. And then a new observational study came out, and that's what everybody in the scientific community somehow managed to point at. And it's frustrating, and we should be skeptical about why this is being pointed at after the fact. And I think, as your work has shown, what has already been done with the NTP and these reports and FAN, this has been years, 4 years, if I remember correctly, in the work. It's not just one study. So now, again, they're going, ignore the work that's been going on for 4 years and the multiple studies and focus on this one we want you to look at. I don't know how anybody wouldn't see that as at least somehow slightly dishonest. I think that's important.
It is important. And like you said, I mean, obviously science does get updated. So when new information comes out, we should look at it and say, okay, how does this fit into what we've already known? But this is why I think this story is so important, because on the surface, like you said, you get, okay, a new piece of information. And let's imagine you're just a normie mainstream person who kind of vaguely knows about this topic. And you heard, oh, I heard there was some studies in the last couple of years claiming there's problems with fluoride. Oh, but now there's a newer study that they're referencing. And that newer study, it says the opposite. So then maybe one might kind of just make the naively make the assumption, oh, the newer study must have had better science and more information and more data because it's new, right? But that is not the case. And this is why these emails are so important, because once again, we're getting a behind the scenes look at what goes on to shape a particular, and this is again, a peer reviewed published study that came out from Dr. Kumar. And again, it found the exact opposite of what we've been reporting and what the NTP has been showing. So that's why it's important. So let's get into a little bit of the details of what these emails showed. For one, the main thing is the emails make it clear, and as the Fluoride Action Network says, that Kumar is not some sort of independent voice who's just studying fluoride safety because he's curious about the topic or has some kind of scientific or dental interest. Clearly, he's the California State Dental Director. He's tied to the American Dental Association, like most people in that position are. And the American Dental Association, other organizations have for decades, 70 years now, said that water fluoridation is safe, and it's one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. But in the emails, Kumar admits that and this is his word, that his, quote, job is to promote fluoridation, and that he is, quote, literally being paid to promote fluoridation. So right off the bat, that doesn't sound very impartial or unbiased. And then even before the study was begun, he told some of his colleagues in the emails that his job was to, quote, preempt the NTP. So this is not wild speculation that, oh, maybe this new study was done to try to counter the Fluoride Action Network. He says it his own words. And then again, during the proceedings, we saw the US government, the EPA, argue that this study should be referenced by the judge instead of the previous study. So we can tell there had to be some collusion. Now, these emails don't show Mr. Kumar directly communicating with the EPA's attorneys or anything of that sort, but in his own words, he's saying that he's trying to preempt the NTP, and he said that there was urgency to this task. So he's seemed to be very well aware in these emails, which were just from last year, 2022, that he needed to get this study out as soon as possible so that it could be used in this trial. So I think that's one important point. Another point here is that the emails show that the study was rejected 4 different times before it was eventually accepted, which again, sometimes studies get rejected as they become better, and that can be science. So that on its own, I don't think should discount it from being valuable, but it is noteworthy, especially when you have the person himself saying that he's trying to preempt another study and his job is to promote fluoridation and there's an urgency to the task. One peer reviewer, the emails show, labeled this study superficial, unbalanced, and misleading, and even said that the study had misinformation in it and, quote, would fuel more controversy rather than stimulate prudent science-based decisions. So those are just some of the background conversations happening, and that's what I think is important, as well as the emails we previously had with the NTP study, where you can actually see the peer reviewers' comments, because that gives us, the average people, a peek into a world that we normally have no access to, right? We're just assumed, people are told, oh, this study was peer reviewed, so that's supposed to mean something, but you don't really see the conversations that led to it getting there. And we can assume, or we're told, well, the conversations that lead to it getting published are all in the name of science and getting to the best information. Clearly, that's not always the case.
And we saw this during COVID-19. I think the average person, to the frustration of the corporate media and the government, are very aware that something's amiss with this. And it doesn't see, is varying opinions about whether that's some large agenda or just profiteering or just incompetence, right? But all of those things are playing a factor. And I think there's just a lot of people that just are been trained not to care if they're told from the higher ups, this is how it's supposed to go. What's most compelling to me is that this is a guy on the record. I mean, this is if we're going to level conflicts of interest, this is like number one. You cannot hold a position where your entire job is to, he says it himself. If you're preempting the stuff, that's not science. That's weaponized science. You're trying to find something to counteract what they're saying. So that's confirmation bias, assuming there's even honesty involved here. But the point is, if he himself is saying his job is to preempt this, then as you discussed in the article, the point is that he will overlook things that are bad and then and promote things that are actually not entirely accurate if it makes that. And as he said, his job is to promote fluoridation. I mean, this is a big deal. This should be bigger news right now.
And that's exactly what happened. I mean, so we'll go a little further here. They're doing, and this I think is another important point, and it does have so many correlations with COVID-19 and with other similar topics like that, because it shows us that these people, scientists, alleged, scientists, I don't even know if these people deserve this title here in this case, can use computer models and statistics to try to frame a conclusion. And in this case, if the models that they have don't fit the conclusion, well, they'll just remove the models completely. And that's what's happened in this case. So there's an email between Kumar and his biostatistician for the study, and from March 5th, 2022, where the statistician reports to Kumar, says that the results are the opposite of what we hoped for. And in response to this, the statistician suggests to him that they can try different models to see if they might reach different results. And he says, quote, although hard, we can test more models to try to identify a threshold that can lead to a non-significant fluctuation in IQ before the threshold. And what he means by that is there's going to be a non-significant fluctuation in IQ before the safety level, right? So here's the safe level that they say fluoride is safe amount in the water. So non-significant fluctuation, which still we should know is still a fluctuation in IQ, but he's just claiming, oh, it's non-significant. And then after that threshold level where they claim it's safe, a significant drop in IQ. And what this means is simply he's trying to say, okay, well, let's just fudge the numbers a little bit so that the drop in IQ comes after the levels that we claim are safe and not before. And that's exactly what they ended up doing. And then they tried to present this study. So once
that's a lie. That's dishonest.
It's using models and it's using science, quote unquote, to try to reach conclusions. So once they did that, though, and then they eventually decided, you know what, it's not going to work. Like, let's just take the whole meta-analysis reference out of there. They came to this conclusion. These meta-analyses show that fluoride exposure relevant to community water fluoridation is not associated with lower IQ scores in children. And then this study, this paper did get accepted, and it was published in Pediatrics, and then was promoted by the American Dental Association as a basis for why the NTP should postpone its report. So again, you can see how we don't have the emails specifically showing Kumar communicating with the NTP or the ADA or any of that at the moment, but it's clear that as soon as this study came out, the ADA steps in and is like, hey, this is why we should ignore the NTP's conclusion, and they're trying to get Director Wojcik, Richard Wojcik of the NTP, to delay the release of the NTP draft report. So for those who don't know kind of on that background, this draft report's been going on for years now. We finally got to a point in the last 6 months where the draft reports from 2022, May and September, were released, and we've reported that on this show. And those conclusions in those draft reports specifically say that fluoride does cause lower IQ in children and has a number of different other problems. But that's still just the draft report. So the final report hasn't come out. And just in the last couple months, we had the Board of Scientific Counselors vote unanimously that the report should be released. But now it is in the hands of the NTP director, Richard Wojcik. He's the one who gets to decide whether or not this comes out. And as I remind people in this article, we have a previous court declaration where Wojcik himself claimed responsibility for blocking the release of this NTP monograph. So the man himself, whether it was Rachel Levine or Richard Wojcik, they've both been named. Wojcik himself kind of taking responsibility. He probably is covering for his boss, so he can, so it doesn't have to go any higher than him. But the point is, the people who claim that they blocked the release of this report in the first place are now in charge of deciding whether or not it's even going to come out. And now we have some more insight into how other studies like this are being manufactured to try to discourage the release of this report. And it's, this should be like front page news. Right. You have science, and I've reached out. I did reach out. I did my due diligence. I have emailed Dr. Kumar at least twice now, and I don't expect he's going to respond. I think that's the thing, is there's these bureaucrats that most of us will never know their names or see their faces are taking actions like this, which are largely consequential and clearly are going to shape the direction, because what if the NTP does decide not to release the report anymore, and they say it's because, well, we have new information, like this study from Dr. Kumar? Well, then we could see that was exactly what they're aiming for, and hopefully that's not what happens. But if it does, then they won. They've had the effect of manufacturing science to reach the conclusions that they want us to believe, and that is a very dangerous place for us to be. But again, we saw this all through COVID-19.
Yeah. Well, man, your work on this has been stellar, and it's unfortunate that this is not getting the attention it deserves, because this as you said, this should be international news. I mean, this is a really big deal. We've talked about p-hacking, the idea of how science can, you just continue to change up the stats until you get something that seems relevant. And there's some scientific method there to some degree, but it's dishonest, and other scientists will acknowledge that. So I hope this I hope this will get the attention it deserves. And I know you'll be keeping up on the story. So thank you for keeping us apprised on this. And we're looking forward to your next report.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, brother.
Yeah, as always, man. All right, well, let's get back to the daily wrap up.
Thanks again for tuning into another episode of the Independent Review. See you next week.